During the early days of 2020, there was only talk of one thing. The Russians are coming! The build-up on the Ukrainian border seems to make it clear that the invasion would only be a matter of time. Nevertheless, at the time, the expectations of virtually everyone were for a triumphant ride. Do you remember?
U.S. arms sent to Ukraine would blunt but not stop a Russian invasion. The Russian army could quickly overwhelm the Ukrainian military, even one that is backed by the United States and its European allies. Ukraine's army is underfunded, outgunned, and not ready to stop a Russian invasion.
These were just two examples of what seemed to be the general consensus. Barring a major surprise, the Ukrainian armed forces had no chance against Russia's gigantic and powerful war machine. At that time, there was talk of things like evacuating Zelensky or launching a guerrilla war. However, the Ukrainians held on, and they did so against all odds. For months and months, Ukrainians have seen their towns, villages, and fields being razed to the ground. Casualties, for their part, number in the tens of thousands. The Russians have destroyed power plants, thousands of schools, hundreds of hospitals, and all kinds of infrastructure. To give you an idea, in April 2023, the estimate of direct damage caused by the war already exceeded $150 billion. Ukrainians have had to face bombs, cold, and darkness, and yet they have held on. And not only that, now they have even regained the initiative. Let's just say that the Ukrainians were not willing to lose this war under any circumstances, and now they want to win it. The question, the big question that we still haven't answered is, why do Ukrainians still want to fight? Well, we're going to take a look at that right here, right now, on VisualPolitik. But first, let me have a word. Do you like what we do? Do you want to help us grow and at the same time receive a lot of extra content? Well, you just have to join our Patreon community. With a little help, you can make this project keep growing and improving. And you will also receive our special bulletin, the weekly snapshot, unique merchandising, and much more content. We'll leave you all the info down in the description. Many thanks from the bottom of our hearts to all of you who already give us your support. And now, let's get started. I think if there is one thing that we can all agree on, it is the great merit of the Ukrainian resistance. Okay, we now know that the Russian military and armaments had more holes in them than a Swiss cheese. Okay, we know that the enormous corruption has sucked it dry. And okay, we have seen all of the huge flows of arms that have come into Ukraine from its Western allies. But still, to have resisted against an army superior in numbers, in weapons, in strength, in area, in artillery, and in practically any field is something that has a whole lot of merit. Let's put ourselves in their shoes. It's not easy to watch the Russian bear pounce on you and keep the knife between your teeth, and yet it's exactly what the Ukrainians have done. Not surprisingly, the price has been very high, and it will get even higher. In Ukraine, destruction, annihilation, and casualties are already daily occurrences. Do you remember the images left by the blowing up of the Novokakhovka Dam? Well, just like that. Even so, despite this, polls say that the vast majority of Ukrainians want to fight to the end. They want to drive the Russians out of their country, whatever it takes. You don't believe me? Do you think I'm exaggerating? Well, take a look.
Over 80% of Ukrainians oppose territorial concessions, even at risk of protracted war.
But how is it that, with everything against them, they did not decide to give up when the invasion began? Why don't they do it now? Why on earth do the Ukrainians want to keep on fighting? Why are so many young people willing to go all the way? Well, VisualPolitik viewers, the Ukrainian resistance has several ingredients that have been simmering. Do you know what? To understand the first of them, we have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, specifically to October 1917, when the revolution broke out in the Russian Empire, and then all hell broke loose. Also in Ukraine, which, after proclaiming itself as an independent republic of Russia, suffered a civil war between two sides. The Ukrainian People's Republic, assisted by Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire on the one side, and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, supported by the Bolsheviks, on the other. In the end, it was the latter who won the day, and in 1922, Ukraine joined Russia, Belarus, and South Caucasus to form the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. A union that time proved to be an absolute disaster. By the 1930s, the benefits of having been integrated into the Soviet Union had practically disappeared. Stalin's agrarian policy based on land confiscation and collectivization affected the territory that was known as the breadbasket of the USSR, like no other. Peasants who tried to keep their land were repressed, deported to concentration camps, and even executed. The result? Between 3.5 and 8 million Ukrainians starved to death. At best, we're talking about 10% of the Ukrainian population starving to death because of decisions made in Moscow. It was what has subsequently become known as Holodomor, but that was only the beginning. During the Stalinist years, the Supreme Soviet actively promoted the Russification of Ukraine. This meant restricting and even suppressing the use of Ukrainian and any other aspect of local culture. Of course, all this meant much more repression. After Stalin, the Ukrainians had a brief respite during Nikita Khrushchev's time at the head of the Red Empire, but then Moscow went back to the same strategy. To top it all off, after years of poverty and heavy-handedness, in 1986, there was the Chernobyl disaster, which was, once again, terribly mismanaged by the Soviet leadership in Moscow. So you see, for decades, Moscow and therefore Russia, and Russians by extension, did not exactly accumulate many points to win the hearts of Ukrainians. And perhaps this is why. After Perestroika and the collapse of the USSR in October 1991, they had very clear goals. They wanted to become an independent country again. And as we say around here, no sooner said than done. Ukrainians voted in a referendum, and independence won by an overwhelming majority. Check it out. And take note, because as you can see, independence won in all regions of the country. It won by an overwhelming majority in the Donbass, and also won in Crimea and Sevastopol. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because independence did not bring Moscow's tentacles and influence to an end. Quite the contrary.
Missing the train to Brussels.
In virtually all post-Soviet countries, the transition away from communism was terribly difficult. Everything had to be done from scratch, and naturally, things were no different in Ukraine. The public sector was a mess, the gigantic state apparatus and the suffocating dependence on Moscow was everywhere, and countries had to rebuild from top to bottom in the midst of a brutal economic crisis. To give you an idea, between 1991 and 1998, Ukraine's economy collapsed by more than 60%. In fact, it did not begin to show signs of improvement until the arrival of the new century. But then, a few years later, the great financial crisis arrived, and everything went, once again, down the drain. A disaster. The country seemed doomed never to be able to escape from the pit. Nevertheless, after the great crisis of 2008, something changed. Suddenly, the possibility of signing an association agreement with the European Union arose. And do you know what this meant? Access to the common market could change everything. Suddenly, Ukrainian products could flow westward like there was no tomorrow. What's more, European investments could help modernize the country. Even so, contain your euphoria, because there was one problem, and not just a small one. Can you guess what? 3, 2, 1, exactly, Moscow. Negotiations with the European Union started off at full steam ahead. However, just when they seemed to be on the verge of reaching a successful conclusion, they suddenly went completely off the rails. President Viktor Yanukovych, who had promised to move this agreement forward, froze the process. Not surprisingly, Russia was behind this move.
Ukraine drops plan to go west, turns east. Yanukovych's prime minister issued the dramatic order to suspend the process in the interests of national security and renew active dialogue in Moscow.
The idea that the ex-Soviet republics were going around flirting with the West was something Putin was unwilling to countenance. He resented it more than Dracula resented garlic for breakfast. So Yanukovych and all Ukrainians would have to surrender to his power. The problem, the big problem, VisualPolitik community, is that in 2013, just as in 2022, the Russian president did not estimate well how Ukrainians would feel about being pushed around. And then disaster struck. Listen up.
The stubborn hope.
22nd of November 2013, as soon as the freezing of the agreement with the European Union was announced, Kyiv's Independence Square, usually known as Maidan, began to heat up. Political parties, social media platforms, activists. Suddenly, this square became the epicenter of a gigantic anti-government protest with thousands and thousands of people. All the opposition to Yanukovych and his ties with Moscow were represented in this place. It was exactly the same place where in 2004, the Orange Revolution against electoral theft had taken place to make Yanukovych himself president to the detriment of his pro-European opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, who, by the way, was poisoned during the election campaign of the same year. Who poisoned him? It's not been possible to determine, but you can guess where all suspicions are directed. In this case, as in so many others, all roads lead to Moscow. But let's not get sidetracked. The situation escalated rapidly, and in January 2014, the government tried to evict the protesters from the square through a harsh repression that left dozens dead and wounded. At that time, the protesters organized themselves by creating defense units. Ukraine was on the brink of the abyss. Fortunately, everything ended with the resignation and flight from the country of President Yanukovych, which at the same time meant a heavy defeat for Moscow. But wait a minute, was everything really over? Of course not. Vladimir Putin was not just going to stand idly by. I'm sure you all remember news stories like these.
Russian invasion of Crimea fuels fears of Ukraine conflict. 21 times journalists have confirmed masked troops in Crimea are Russian.
Indeed, Putin put his foot down and decided to counterattack. He did so by first invading and then annexing the Ukrainian province of Crimea. At the same time, he fueled a civil war in the Donbass, the richest and most developed region in all of Ukraine. At that time, Ukraine could do practically nothing.
Only about 50,000 troops could have been deployed when the war in Crimea began in February 2014, but of those, only about 6,000 were combat ready. The Russian operation effectively ended with 2 savage defeats of Ukrainian forces. Analysis by the Jamestown Foundation, July 2021.
The result? The loss of Crimea and the proclamation of 2 new republics. Today, also annexed by Russia, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, 2 puppet states of Moscow. And guess what? This operation was also a real disaster. In the new republics, the institutions were assaulted. An ultra-nationalist, ultra-conservative, and ultra-militarized model was imposed. Many, if not most, of the large companies and productive assets, such as mines and steel mills, were expropriated or put at the disposal of oligarchs friendly to Moscow. The result? Economic activity collapsed and jobs disappeared. It is estimated that about half, that is 50% of the entire population, packed their bags and left for Russia. The rest of Europe, and above all, the rest of Ukraine, particularly to nearby regions such as Kharkiv. As you can imagine, Moscow does not exactly instill positive emotions in all these people either. Look at what one writer in the region was saying at the end of 2021.
They have managed to rebuild a Soviet system in the occupied territories, and not the Soviet system of the 1960s and 1970s, but the Soviet system of the 1930s and 1940s, with dungeons, with torture chambers, a system where lives are ruined if you dare to write or say anything negative about these republics and their authorities. Stanislav Osiv, novelist and journalist from Donetsk.
And that is not all. The Russian intervention forced Ukraine to rebuild its armed forces. In other words, because of Russia since the beginning of 2014, the country that was the poorest in Europe had to more than double its military spending. Of course, time proved them right. That spending was much needed. The good news for Ukraine was that international aid also started to arrive. Check it out.
UK military training in Ukraine, symbolic move that risks Russian ire. US troops begin training Ukrainian regular forces.
And so, little by little, it was that Ukraine, and particularly Ukrainians, were preparing for war, right up until 24th of February 2022, when Putin ultimately unleashed his firestorm. As we all know, a lot of time has passed since then, and the war not only continues, but it is now the Ukrainians themselves who are pushing the initiative. But what really explains their enormous tenacity? Well, let's do a little exercise. Let's imagine for a moment that we go back to 25th of February 2022. We are Ukrainians, and we are young. The Russian invasion has just begun. Missiles are falling on Ukraine as Putin's hordes try to reach the country's major cities, including the capital. We were born in an independent Ukraine, where, nevertheless, Moscow's tentacles reach everywhere. Your grandparents have told you about the Holodomor and the relatives they lost because of Moscow. They've also told you about how the Soviet Union tried to Russianize Ukraine. Your parents have told you about how difficult their life was, about the repression, and probably also about the political police. The dreaded KGB. You've read about the Chernobyl disaster. You've lived through Moscow's attempts to have your country cut its ties with the West and the subsequent Euromaidan revolution. You have known the horror of the 2014 war, and you may have known people who died, who were victims, or who were mobilized during that war. Despite everything, for the past few years, you have dreamed of Ukraine modernizing and embracing the wealthier and more prosperous countries of Europe. But now, instead, you are once again witnessing how the Russian government continues to destroy and annihilate your country with bombs, missiles, tanks, and soldiers. So, the question many Ukrainians ask, and still ask themselves, is, how could we not fight? And so, the majority of Ukrainians have come to a very clear conclusion. Either they defeat Russia once and for all, or they will never be able to have a normal, prosperous, and peaceful country. Russia has become their worst nightmare. On the other hand, if they do succeed, if they manage to defeat Russia, Ukraine could join the European Union and NATO within a few years, and thus try to emulate the impressive development of countries such as Poland or the Baltic republics. And that's exactly what explains the news item we saw earlier.
Over 80% of Ukrainians oppose territorial concessions, even at risk of protracted war.
As you can see from the results of this survey conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, Ukrainians are mostly willing to continue fighting to regain their territory. As you can see, it is, so to speak, an all or nothing bet. The question is, will they succeed? Will they defeat Russia? If you were Ukrainian, how would you have reacted to the Russian invasion? Leave us your impression in the comments, and as always, let's open a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it. If you like what we do and you want to give us a hand, and at the same time receive more content, take a look at our Patreon page. We'll leave you all the information in that description. All the best. See you next time.